Welcome to this discussion of the article that went out Friday. This is the last of the series, Heaven, Hell, and the Immortal Soul. And we're gonna talk about, do we have an immortal soul? And we're gonna look at this from a scriptural standpoint, not the tradition of men or religion, but just what the scripture, what the words say and mean, actually mean in these letters that have been written by these Hebrew authors. And with me today is my good friend, brother, and pal, Jean-Paul. Jean-Paul, JP, why don't you get us going here? I know you've got some questions.
Well, hello, everyone. Yes, well, I read these articles and there's always something that pops up as we're going through. So the soul, it's of real interest to me as I started discovering a lot of these traditions of men that had been penned, I guess, within scripture, or even some of the philosophies that I believed in over the years. As I've come to know a little bit more truth, things have sort of crumbled around that. And I remember as these doctrines that I had so much studied and learned about, when they started falling down all around me, that it was like a domino effect. One went, the other went, the other went, and so on and so forth. So this whole idea of the soul and where we go once we die and all these kinds of things were of interest. And interestingly enough, I was up with a few friends last night, and that actually came up as to where we go when we die. Very interesting conversation, because the most common, I guess, understanding or philosophy is that when we die, we either go to heaven or to hell. And they were talking about one of their loved ones that had passed away and where he was going to go and all this kind of stuff. And it was really interesting, to take a step back. And I didn't get into this teaching thing about trying to explain everything at that point, but it's really interesting to see how ingrained it was. There was one person around the table, though, that said, I don't know what I believe. So I had a bit of a conversation with that person a little later, but so it's a very interesting concept, this thing about heaven, hell, and the immortal soul. So in scripture, if I am correct, the word for soul is translated from the Hebrew word nefesh. Is that correct?
Nefesh, that's correct.
And what does that mean? Like in the Hebrew, from the Hebrew language perspective, what does nefesh mean?
The Hebrew perspective of a person is not that they're divided into three parts: body, mind, soul, or spirit. That is a completely Greek concept, lifted literally out of the pages of Plato's book, The New Republic. And what he was trying to do was to explain and bring order to the social fabric that he was involved in. But at the same time, these Greeks believed in a lot of different gods. And we see the concept of some of those gods infiltrating into the words of scripture. For instance, Hades is mentioned several times in scripture as a place of hell. But Hades is the Greek god of the underworld. And that Greek concept doesn't have any place in these Hebrew scriptures. Once these writings were penned by these Hebrew authors, after hundreds of years, the only copies that we have of the Messianic writings are Greek. The original Hebrew letters they're gone. We know that they were written in Hebrew because, first of all, the authors were Hebrew. They were speaking of their experience with a Hebrew God, Yahweh. And those letters were just that. They were letters penned to other people that they had come in contact with and knew, just like you would write a letter to me. Although in today's world, people don't do that very much anymore. But back then, that was the only means of real communication they had when people are separated by distance. And so from that viewpoint, it is developed this unique Hebrew perspective that when we read these words in English, we have to constantly remind ourselves, and it can't be repeated enough, that what we are reading is layers of translation from one language to another, Hebrew to Greek. There's some Latin in there. And then finally, we get into 3 different incarnations of English. And as we've discussed previously, any translator worth his salt will tell you that whenever you translate from one language to another, you just lose stuff. And what has taken place also with these writings is that these Greek translators who were steeped in the new Roman Christian religion, when they translated these words, they were able to insert or overlay the words with their particular viewpoint or aspect of Christianity on how these words should be read in English. Consequently, we get a concept of the Trinity, 3 different gods, which again is the influence of the Greek philosophers. But you won't find the word Trinity anywhere in Scripture. And even though I can see how men have taken different scriptures and cobbled them together to build this imperial doctrine, that's not what the scriptures were given. Welcome to this discussion of the article that went out Friday. This is the last of the series, Heaven, Hell, and the Immortal Soul. And we're gonna talk about, do we have an immortal soul? And we're going to look at this from a scriptural standpoint, not the tradition of men or religion, but just what the scripture, what the words say and mean, actually mean in these letters that have been written by these Hebrew authors. And with me today is my good friend, brother, and pal, Jean-Paul. Jean-Paul, JP, why don't you get us going here? I know you've got some questions.
Well, hello, everyone. Yes, well, I read these articles and there's always something that pops up as we're going through. So the soul, it's of real interest to me as I started discovering a lot of these traditions of men that had been penned, I guess, within scripture, or even some of the philosophies that I believed in over the years. As I've come to know a little bit more truth, things have sort of crumbled around that. And I remember as these doctrines that I had so much studied and learned about, when they started falling down all around me, that it was like a domino effect. One went, the other went, the other went, and so on and so forth. So this whole idea of the soul and where we go once we die and all these kinds of things were of interest. And interestingly enough, I was up with a few friends last night, and that actually came up as to where we go when we die. Very interesting conversation, because the most common, I guess, understanding or philosophy is that when we die, we either go to heaven or to hell. And they were talking about one of their loved ones that had passed away and where he was going to go and all this kind of stuff. And it was really interesting, to take a step back. And I didn't get into this teaching thing about trying to explain everything at that point, but it's really interesting to see how ingrained it was. There was one person around the table, though, that said, I don't know what I believe. So I had a bit of a conversation with that person a little later, but so it's a very interesting concept, this thing about heaven, hell, and the immortal soul. So in scripture, if I am correct, the word for soul is translated from the Hebrew word nefesh. Is that correct?
Nefesh, that's correct.
And what does that mean? Like in the Hebrew, from the Hebrew language perspective, what does nefesh mean?
The Hebrew perspective of a person is not that they're divided into three parts: body, mind, soul, or spirit. That is a completely Greek concept, lifted literally out of the pages of Plato's book, The New Republic. And what he was trying to do was to explain and bring order to the social fabric that he was involved in. But at the same time, these Greeks believed in a lot of different gods. And we see the concept of some of those gods infiltrating into the words of scripture. For instance, Hades is mentioned several times in scripture as a place of hell. But Hades is the Greek god of the underworld. And that Greek concept doesn't have any place in these Hebrew scriptures. Once these writings were penned by these Hebrew authors, after hundreds of years, the only copies that we have of the Messianic writings are Greek. The original Hebrew letters they're gone. We know that they were written in Hebrew because, first of all, the authors were Hebrew. They were speaking of their experience with a Hebrew God, Yahweh. And those letters were just that. They were letters penned to other people that they had come in contact with and knew, just like you would write a letter to me. Although in today's world, people don't do that very much anymore. But back then, that was the only means of real communication they had when people are separated by distance. And so from that viewpoint, it is developed this unique Hebrew perspective that when we read these words in English, we have to constantly remind ourselves, and it can't be repeated enough, that what we are reading is layers of translation from one language to another, Hebrew to Greek. There's some Latin in there. And then finally, we get into 3 different incarnations of English. And as we've discussed previously, any translator worth his salt will tell you that whenever you translate from one language to another, you just lose stuff. And what has taken place also with these writings is that these Greek translators who were steeped in the new Roman Christian religion, when they translated these words, they were able to insert or overlay the words with their particular viewpoint or aspect of Christianity on how these words should be read in English. Consequently, we get a concept of the Trinity, 3 different gods, which again is the influence of the Greek philosophers. But you won't find the word Trinity anywhere in Scripture. And even though I can see how men have taken different scriptures and cobbled them together to build this imperial doctrine, that's not what the scriptures were given for. And where you have, from Genesis to Revelation, you have some streams of thought that are very well laid out, and in an orderly fashion. This Trinity thing just it doesn't appear. In fact, just the opposite. If you were to try to convince a Hebrew that there were 3 different gods in this makeup of the Christian God, they'd run you off, because it completely goes against the first word of the 10 words of the Father found in Exodus 20, which says, "You shall have no other gods beside me, and you shall not make any carved images of those gods to serve and to worship." And here we have Christianity that is worshiping 3 different gods. If you ask most Christians, is Jesus God, they will answer yes. And they have elevated him to a position that is just not scriptural. And Yeshua himself, his name isn't Jesus, it was the Hebrew. His parents were Hebrew, steeped in the Hebrew culture, Torah followers. They're not going to give their son a Greek name. They're going to give their son a Hebrew name. And his name was Yeshua. And following that line of thought, we also have the name of Yahweh, this God that everybody's talking about, the Holy One of Israel in Scripture. his name appears over 6,500 times in Scripture, but not once does it appear in any of our modern translations. And it's because the nature of Christianity, particularly when it was formed and then over the centuries, as it's been handed down from one to another, their purpose in forming this Christian religion was to jettison anything Hebraic that might tarnish it, and they were frenzied about it, and that's why and then they took all of these theologies and ideas and went and translated the Tanakh, what's been renamed the Old Testament, and laid those theologies that they developed out of the Messianic writings, which has been renamed the New Testament, and overlaid them over on these Hebrew scriptures. You know, most people don't realize that the what they call the Old Testament in their Bible is not a translation from the Hebrew. It's from the Greek Septuagint into English. And so that's what I'm saying. You just lose stuff in all of these layers of translations. And so we find there's no Trinity in Scripture. There's no rapture in Scripture. There's you don't find the word rapture in there either. There's no heaven. I take that back. There is a heaven, but it's not some fairyland place above the clouds. It's within. And again, we discussed this in the last article that Yeshua quotes Isaiah 61 that says that heaven is Yahweh's throne. And he says in John 14, 23 and 24, that if you keep my words, you love me. If you don't keep my words, you don't love me. But those who keep my words, my Father will come and abide in him. He will take up his residency in him. He will dwell in him. And I will come and abide in him. And the words you hear are not mine, they're my Father's. This is a consistent theme all through Scripture, from Genesis to Revelation. And so when we get to this point of Revelation, and it starts talking about, you know, the translated word from the Hebrew ruach to the, you know, people having their own spirit. There's no scripture anywhere that says that man has a spirit intrinsic to himself. Even though it's popular worldwide, and as you said, JP, you know, people are convinced of that. There's no scripture. And so when people ask me, you know, where do you go when you die? I just tell them, you go to the grave. You just die. You don't go somewhere. Yeshua, when he died and was laid in that tomb, he didn't go somewhere. As the scripture out of is it 1st or 2nd Peter says, that the Catholics took it and incorporated it into the Apostles' Creed, but it's not in Scripture. Boy, I tell you what, I got off on a rant that time, didn't I?
Well, there was an awful lot of information. So, okay, so let's go back a little bit, because, you know, again, this understanding about this understanding about mind, body, soul, or mind, body, spirit, or this three faction, or this three part. So many people have had all these teachings, knowings, whatever. So in all reality, in the Hebraic view, this does not exist. It comes from the Greek mindset. So then the next thing is where, so if we don't have a soul, so when we die, we don't go to a place, there's no, is it immortal? Like what we call it, the immortal soul. So the soul doesn't have a life of itself.
It does not. The soul, again, going back to the Hebrew perspective, is the nephesh, and the nephesh is one homogenized unit. We're not separated into parts. It's all of us. And the scripture says that there's only one spirit, and his name is Yahweh. And what happened with Adam, the first Hebrew, was that when the Father breathed life into him, Adam also had part of Yahweh's spirit. He was infilled with Yahweh's spirit, and as long as he obeyed the Father, he was able to move in that very intimate place with the Father. But the Father told him that you can eat of any fruit of any tree in the garden except the tree of the knowledge between what's good and what's evil. And he said, on the day that you eat of that fruit, you'll die. Well, he and Chaya both ate of the fruit. They didn't die. Genesis 5 tells us that he lived to be 930 years old. And we know Yahweh is not a liar, so you got to twist your brain around, bend our thinking to Yahweh's thinking, and ask, what died that day? If it wasn't his physical body, what died? And it was this spirit, the shared spirit with Yahweh, that in him died. And it didn't exist anymore, which is why he needed to be separated from the tree of life. Yahweh says, unless he partake of the tree of life, and he live in this state that he's in forever. So he was separated and put into the world, just like any other person that occupied the world at that time, but he was without a spirit. And even though he was without a spirit, he had disobeyed the Father, just like any father. You know, I've got children that don't do things that I've, asked them not to. They do things that I've asked them not to do, but I still love them. And the Father was the same way with his family. This was the first of his family that he was creating to be a light to the other nations of the world, to attract them to this kingdom of light. And so the first thing he did for Adam and Chaya was to he killed some animals and fashioned clothes for them to cover their nakedness. Prior to eating of that fruit of the knowledge of between what's good and evil, they had no conception of the fact that they were naked.
Right. So as you were explaining that, something sort of came to mind. So Adam walked in the cool of the day with the spirit of Yahweh attached to him or within him.
Within him, yes.
You've heard the word echad. So when Yeshua said, the Father and I are one, he didn't mean that he was God. He meant that the Spirit, did he mean at that point that the Spirit was living within him?
No, everywhere from the time of Adam's separation in the garden, they were still able to come into the presence of the Father. We noted how, the Father spoke to Cain before he murdered Abel. And all of the patriarchs in the Tanakh, when they came into the presence of the Father, it was accessible to all of his family, but it was external. Everything that they experienced was external. And it says that when Yahweh's Spirit came upon them, that's literally what happened. It came upon them for a season, while they prophesied or did different things, but then it left. Even with Yeshua, when he was immersed before John, when he came up out of the water, Yahweh spoke, with a loud voice, "This is my son in whom I'm well pleased." But some of those who were not attuned to Yahweh's voice just thought it was thunder. But that spirit, there was a spirit like a dove that came upon Yahweh, because he had not yet been that place where Yahweh breathed the breath of life into him in that tomb had not taken place yet. But he walked and spoke as though it had. This again is a perspective of Hebraic thought that is where they speak of things that haven't taken place yet as though they have. One of the illustrations of this kind of thought is with Abraham and Methuselah, when he, not Methuselah, is it Methuselah that he came and gave gifts to? JP?
Of course,
the guy that lived for 100 years.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, it wasn't Methuselah. Anyways, yeah.
It was this guy, and he gave Abraham, he offered Abraham
Melchizedek.
I got the M right. Melchizedek, and he gave gifts to Abraham, correct?
Correct.
And in that passage, it says, when Shaul, the Hebrew apostle Paul, was speaking about it in the epistles he wrote, he said it was though Abraham was making offerings and sacrifices to Levi, who had not been born yet, but was in his loins. It's how they look at that it's even though he hadn't been born, it was as though Abraham was reaching out to him. So it's this concept that all these Hebrews, their perspective, the way they thought. And so Yeshua was speaking, the Father had shown him glimpses of what his purpose was, which was, he says in Luke 4:43, to preach the kingdom of Yahweh, not the kingdom of salvation. You won't find that phrase in Scripture, but the kingdom of Yahweh. And his purpose was to restore that kingdom as it was in the beginning in the garden with Adam, to all of these family members who, through this generational lineage, this was their inheritance. This is what they were looking for. And as a kinsman redeemer, he had the authority to rescue his family out of distress. The so that when he died, and he didn't understand, I don't think he understood completely what was going to transpire before him until he was in the garden, and the scripture said he sweat blood from his forehead. I mean, that was an intense thing that was going on between he and the Father, when the Father was showing him what was about to take place. And sure enough, he went through the scourging, and which again we spoke of in the last discussion, that it basically he bled out from the time of the scourging, then into the scourging, until he was put on the cross and was hung there for 9 hours, 6 hours, from 9 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, about 3 in the afternoon. And it's what killed him. And so when he was laid in the tomb, he had this pristine body that had never disobeyed the Father. And it gave the Father the opportunity to come back in and essentially start over with Yeshua and breathe the breath of life into him again. And again, Yeshua then, when he was resurrected, emerged as spirit. Now, he had a body, but granted, it was a transformed body, but it was still a body nonetheless. He told the disciples to, put your fingers in my wounds. And he was hungry. He said, "Is anybody got anything to eat?" And they gave him the fish, and he ate it. But he was spirit. When he appeared, the disciples thought he was a demon spirit, and he said, "Do demon spirits have bodies?" That wasn't what he was. He was who and as he spoke, they recognized him. But the first thing he did as spirit, when he appeared to them in that room, was he breathed the breath of life on them. And that was the precursor of what was to come 50 days later on Shavuot, the Feast of Oaths, when the Father fulfilled his oath that he made with himself to rescue his family out of this place of death and despair.
So upon his renewed or revitalized body, you touched on this a little bit earlier about where in the Apostles' Creed they said that he went down to hell. I think it's in 2 Peter, when Peter says that he went to preach to the lost souls or condemned souls, or I don't know if you remember that scripture, but do you?
I remember I remember this.
You know what Peter meant by that, if he didn't go there or do that?
I don't know that anybody knows, really. It's a complicated scripture. But again, we have to look at these words from the perspective of the Hebrew author that wrote them, that understood. Peter understood what happened on Shavuot. He understood that there wasn't, he didn't have a separate spirit to go anywhere, and neither did Yeshua. It was athemia to what Yeshua taught and what the Father taught in the Tanakh. And so I have an explanation for it in the article. I'm not going to go into it right now because it's too complicated. But if you read it, you can make your own assumptions based on what's being said there. If you don't agree with it, that's fine. Don't send me a lot of letters, emails. That's my view. These words that I'm putting on paper is what the Father has shown me. I give supporting evidence in the links, the highlighted words that are linked to other verses and other supporting documents. And you can follow those and see for yourself. Keep an open mind and see for yourself if those words aren't true or not.
So if Yeshua was walking in this world, one with the Father in terms of obeying his words, obviously hearing his voice, seeing what Father wanted him to see, would it be the same for us in terms of living our life here and then dying and resurrecting on that day of Yahweh? Is that sort of the same?
That's the hope that we have. Yeshua said a couple of times, follow me. I am the example for you to follow. My life is the example for you to follow. And he showed us what happens in that resurrection. And the Father promises that those of us, when Yeshua was resurrected, he opened that portal, that gateway again to where he could have the intimacy of Yahweh's Spirit, just as Adam did in the garden. And what he did was he didn't keep it for himself. He opened it up for any who would come and embrace the Father for who he says he is, and who Yeshua says he is the kinsman redeemer. That, and you know, for those who keep the 10 words of the Father, you know, they can come and be in this kingdom as Yeshua. He in John 17, Yeshua was praying to the Father just before he went to the cross, and he said, Father, I pray for these 12 that they become ichad, or one, or in unity with you, just as in like fashion, in similar manner, I am one with you. And then he goes on down into verse 20 and 21, and he expands that. He says, not only do I pray for these 12, but I pray that for anybody who would believe on their words, that they become ichad with you, just as in like fashion, in similar manner, I am ichad with you. So when we embrace Yahweh, in John 1:12, it says, for those who embrace him, Yahweh, for who he says he is, to them he gives power. Some translations say authority, but power to become children of Yahweh. We don't automatically become children. And the Greek word that is translated as the English power is exousia, and it means the power of choice. We have been given the power of choice. By embracing the Father's words, we have the power of choice to choose what we're going to do, how we're going to behave, so that we can become children of Yahweh. And that's why Paul says that it's this race, it's a lifelong journey. And it's like a race that, you know, you don't collect being the winner until you reach the finish line. And to those who endure to the end, the scripture says, to them, Yahweh gives the crown of life.
So if you go back to the theology of Yeshua was God, because he says he's one, then if you become one like he was, then you become a God. Is some of the theologies or doctrines or beliefs out there. And there is a scripture, there is a scripture somewhere, I believe it's in Psalms don't exactly know. I think it's 34. Ye two are gods, or maybe 88. Anyways, ye two are gods. So just, I guess, just an explanation of because I know that, again, these theologies come out of misunderstanding of Hebraic understanding or perspective. So how would you explain that in terms of how it would be explained in Hebrew mindset or perspective?
You know, Yeshua quoted that verse. And what happened with Adam? When the serpent beguiled Eve, what he beguiled her with was the notion that she and Adam would become as Yahweh. And he wasn't lying to her, because when they took of the fruit of that tree of the knowledge between what was good and what was evil, they became gods to be able to determine for themselves what was good. You know, apart from Yahweh's words, the hardest thing that I have encountered in my walk with the Father is just accepting the fact that what he says is good is good. You know, what I think is good oftentimes has come around and bit me in the butt, because my understanding of what is good is lacking. And so what we have been given the power to do is to choose to keep the Father's words in what he says is good, whether we understand that or not. And what I've discovered is, in embracing those words of what he says is good, you know, that's part of his nature. We're told in Exodus 34, 5-7, that his nature is goodness and kindness. There's some other things in there too that we tend to think are bad, such as the sins of the fathers are passed to subsequent generations until that sin is stopped. And again, we have to discover that the only sin that there is in Scripture is breaking one of the 10 words. It's not the morality of the world that we're talking about. In fact, the word moral or immoral or mortality, you won't find it in the original languages in Scripture.
Okay, so coming back to the question of ye two are gods, then it comes back to the perspective or the understanding of what God is. Because for a lot of people, it now means that you have this gift or this power, or that you're just like him.
We are just like him, but the real enemy in all of this is man's self-determination. That is what separates us from what the Father is saying, because we set ourselves up as God. We worship ourselves, and everything we do is to advance our best condition, not realizing that that's not what the words of Yahweh and the words of Yeshua, who is the example of our life, say. Now, Yeshua never said he was Yahweh. He never positioned himself as a God. He said he only spoke what he heard the Father speak, and he only did what he saw the Father do. And he didn't deter from that at all. What he heard the Father say was what the Father had written in the Tanakh. And so this thing about Jesus being God, yes, he was Echad within the Spirit, but he didn't replace Yahweh. He became as Spirit because he bent his will to keeping the words of the Father, and that's what caused him to become Echad. And in the same regard, when we bend our will to keep the words of Yahweh, we then become Echad with the Father, and we become his children. And that is what hope we have, that we take to the grave, just as Yeshua took to the grave. When Yeshua went into the tomb, the only thing he had was the promise that the Father was going to resurrect him. And I'm not even sure he understood completely. Well, he did too, because going back to your thought about 2 Peter, the best illustration we have of what happens when somebody dies is Lazarus. He died and he didn't go somewhere. His spirit didn't float around. He went to the grave and he died and he started smelling. He was, rotting. And when Yeshua called him out of that grave, he was resurrected and he came forth not as a spirit, but as a nephesh, who he was. And Lazarus eventually died. He wasn't resurrected in immortality. He was just resurrected as nephesh, and eventually he died. Everyone in Scripture who was ever resurrected before Yeshua, they all died eventually. And that's why we know that, these spirits don't go flying off somewhere. Neither did Yeshua, because he doesn't have a spirit apart from the Father. Or he was apart from the Father until he was resurrected, and then he became Echad, and he shared that same spirit. And we share that same spirit right now. We have access to what all of those patriarchs in the Tanakh just longed for. They knew where they had come from, and they were longing for that time when it would be restored, but they didn't have it.
So, talking about time, in the article, you talk about time. Can you explain a little bit about what you said in the article concerning time, its constructs, where it comes from, and the history of time?
Time, as we know it, didn't exist before 1847. And it came about to help unify the train routes that were taking place, because they would go to different places and each place had a different way of keeping the time. The definition of time is a measurement between the beginning of an event and the ending of that event. Well, we're told in Isaiah and in Jeremiah that Yahweh has no beginning and no ending. So if you don't have a beginning to measure from and an ending to measure to, you don't have any time frame. And in Isaiah, it also says that Yahweh abides in eternity. Well, if there's no time with Yahweh, if he abides in eternity and there's no time there, then all you have is right now. And that is where Yahweh lives. He lives in the moment. This is why Yeshua said, don't take any thought about tomorrow, because sufficient for today is the evil thereof. You know, people are always looking to the future to escape the life that they have. And what the Hebrew perspective of life is about is not escape, but learning to abide in the present moment, wherever we're at. That's a brief synopsis. You know, this idea of the world being divided into time zones. It only came about in the 1920s as a result of several nations getting together and agreeing to set their time clocks, you know, in the accordance to that time zone asphyxiation.
So this is a relatively new idea. I mean, for us, we grew up with it and it's been part of our lives forever. But globally, this is a relatively new idea or new concept.
Relatively speaking, yes, it's in contrast with everything that came before. It's just a very narrow slice in the equation.
Right.
Before,
as you were talking, I was thinking, imagine being at that place where you can live just now. It escapes concept, right? So to not think of like a few minutes ago or yesterday or last week, or not think of tomorrow or next week or Christmas or holiday or whatever you want to, how freeing would that be?
Well, that's where I live, and it's really free. I have found that most people either live in the past, they can't let go of things that have happened in the past, and they drag them into the present, or they live in the future because they're dissatisfied with what their life is today, and they're just trudging through it, hoping that, you know, there's something in the future that will come and rescue them out of this life. But that's not what Scripture reveals. You know, Scripture, when we're resurrected on that day, we're not going somewhere. We're going to be right here on terra firma, and it's going to be a different environment, but it's going to be right here on the earth. Yahweh loves the earth. And all the things we see happening in the earth today are the destruction and mayhem and violence that's going on is not from Yahweh. You know, in the beginning, he put things into motion, and men have distorted it and caused all of these things that I mentioned that are going on that we're seeing the consequences of today. You can trace every one of them back to men. The diseases, they all began with men and their sordid things that they did.
So it's sort of weird. My mind went there. So what about the weather? Strange question right out of the blue. Is Yahweh punishing us sometimes because of weather, storms? Is that a reality, or is that just an explanation, a figment of our imaginations? What?
A lot of people justify what they see going on, you know, as God sitting up above the clouds playing whack-a-mole. You know, it's a game, and we're just pawns in his game. The reality is that Yahweh does not involve himself in the nature of men without being invited. And he only resides in those who are faithful to his words, because we invite him into our life. And he only stays where he's wanted, and we daily tell him he's wanted in our lives, that we love him. The way he knows we love him is because we keep his words. This is what he says in part of his nature in Exodus 34, and what Yeshua says in John 13 through 15. It's just a perspective that's repeated over and over again in Scripture. And the like I said earlier, that in the beginning he put certain things in motion. He put the weather in motion to cool the earth, to give it moisture, to cause the ground to be fertile, to be able to grow things. But he didn't put the what we're seeing today, and the hurricanes and tornadoes and what do you call them in the East, the big waves,
Tsunamis.
And the fires that are burning. Every year we have 1,000-year event in fires or hurricanes or floods or drought or something. And it's becoming more and more because men have ignored the consequences of their behavior. And it has been the behavior of men that has caused the climate to just become immersive. I mean, it's
so do you think men can change that?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. I believe men could, but the men that are in power, and I'm talking worldwide, their interest is, because they've set themselves up as their own God, their interest is not in how it affects other people, but how much richer can I get, to take care of what I think is necessary. They're the ones that have determined what is good and what is not. You've got a major industry in oil that propels much of what we have at our disposal, and that those men are not they're like me, they disappear. You can't see. They don't have the motive, the perspective to, not all of them, there are a few, but for the most part, the men that rule this world are they're not in league with Yahweh.
Right.
So the chances of them bending their will, unless they see it as a way to increase their profit margin, are not going to be incentivized to do anything.
So my last question, Got a few minutes here. I don't know. I actually wrote it down because I figured that's the way I'm going to be able to explain it the best. It's going back to time, and it's about the Sabbath. So, where is it now? If time is a creation of worldwide organization, in the article you say that time is of no importance to eternity. So how can we put a measurement around the Sabbath?
Well, the Sabbath was put into place at creation, and it is every seventh day. It doesn't have its existence. Its existence is not based on the weather, the stars, the moon, the sun, any event of men. It is based entirely on the seventh day. You know, the sun comes up and goes down, that's a day. Actually, in Hebrew, it begins at midnight, at dusk, and then runs until the following evening at dusk.
So that's the measurement. So that's a measurement of time.
No, it's a measurement of a day.
Okay.
And because it varies. It's not a set time. It moves, it varies. The only way you know that we are entering a new month, according to the Hebrew perspective, is when the first sliver of a new moon is seen, and we never know when that'll happen.
Right. Okay. 3 days and 3 nights.
Because it moves.
Right. Right. So it's not set. It sort of starts at the site, but it's not a set thing. So 3 days and 3 nights, that would be because time had already been sort of established.
Well, 3 days and 3 nights has nothing to do with time. It has to do with the number of days. A day is not set by time.
Right. Okay. See, and as I was reading it, that's where my mind went. Well, so it's the other way around.
Well, men use variations of clocking time or designating time according to the movement of the sun and the movement of the moon. But there's no, because it moves, you have no set, event to be able to determine.
So they took the event and they sort of changed it around and said, okay, well, we're going to start it here and it's going to end here in terms of a timer clock.
Right.
But in nature, it's not a set time, is it? Right.
You're correct.
Okay. All right. I think that's our time.
Well, again, I want to encourage anybody that's listening to this to read the article. We're on these articles, these discussions we have about the articles, we're just skimming the surface on a lot of this, and there's a lot more depth to what's being spoken of in the article. And so read the article, and if you've got questions, send me an email presenting your question. My email's at the bottom of every article and all over the web. So send me your email, and I will answer you. I'm not suggesting that I have all the answers. But I will answer you. It may not be immediately, but I'll get back to you, and then we can have a conversation via email if you'd like. So we're at the end of our time. And so it's time to say
Shalom.
shalom, shalom.